The letter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in black wax, and by the time Gideon Ashworth had broken it open, he understood that his father had left him a duchy the way a man leaves a debt. Quietly, and with every intention that someone else would be left holding it. Thistlemere was the last of the outlying estates, 70 miles north of anywhere that mattered, and the solicitor's letter that accompanied the deed used the word unviable 3 times in 4 paragraphs. The roof had failed 2 winters running. The mill had not turned since the old miller died, and no one had been paid to replace him. The tenant cottages were behind on repair, the orchard behind on pruning, and the ledgers, when Gideon finally sent for them, arrived in a box that smelled of damp and told a story of a property being quietly, methodically let to rot by a land agent named Josiah Prewitt, who had been managing it in the old Duke's name for 11 years, and had somehow, in that time, grown considerably richer than the estate he managed. Gideon read the ledgers twice. Then he did the thing his solicitor advised against, and his mother would have called beneath him, and told no one, not the solicitor, not the household in London, not even his own valet, that he intended to go north himself before he signed the papers that would sell Thistlemere off in pieces to whoever would take it. He did not go as a duke. He went as a man named Ash, hired the ordinary way, with references invented by a solicitor's clerk who owed him a favor and asked no questions in return. He wanted, he told himself, only to see what he was selling before he sold it, to look a ruin in the face once, honestly, before he let it go the way his father had let so many things go, at a distance, through paper, without ever once getting his hands dirty. He did not yet know that the ruin already had a keeper. 7 miles from the house, in a cottage with a mended roof and a garden that fed more mouths than it should have been able to, Elsbeth Calloway had received a letter of her own 3 weeks earlier, and it had cost her considerably more than a duke's ordinary discomfort. Her father had died owing money he had never truly owed, a debt invented, she was nearly certain, though she could not yet prove it, by the same land agent who now controlled every acre for 70 miles in the old Duke's name. The debt had taken the tenancy that had kept her family fed for 3 generations. It had not, however, taken her competence, which Josiah Prewitt discovered to his mild irritation when he arrived to seize the last of the Calloway land and found a 23-year-old woman who understood double-entry bookkeeping better than he did, and who had already, before he could finish his eviction notice, secured a position as land steward of Thistlemere itself, the one property so far gone that no one else would take the post, and so poorly regarded by its absent owner that its steward could hire whomever she pleased. She did not take the position because she loved ruins. She took it because her mother and 2 younger brothers needed a roof, and Thistlemere, whatever else it was, had one. Barely, and only over the kitchen and 1 bedroom. But a roof was a roof, and Elsbeth Calloway had learned early that survival was not romantic. It was arithmetic, done correctly, every single day, without exception, and without complaint. She had written to the solicitor's office herself before ever laying eyes on the estate, asking 3 questions no other applicant for the post had thought to ask: the condition of the mill wheel, the number of tenant families still in residence, and whether the previous steward's records had been kept or destroyed. The clerk who read her letter aloud to his employer had laughed, not unkindly, at the presumption of a tenant's daughter interrogating a duchy's paperwork, as though she had any standing to. But he had answered her anyway, because there was no one else applying for a post at a property everyone in 3 parishes had already quietly written off. And 3 weeks later, Elsbeth Calloway packed what little her family still owned into a single cart and drove north toward a ruin no one wanted, with her mother beside her, saying nothing, and her 2 brothers asleep against the trunks in the back, because there was nowhere else left to drive to. She did not cry on that drive, though she had every reason to. She had cried once, the night the eviction notice came, alone in the dark where no one could see it and hold it against her later, and had decided, somewhere before dawn, that it was the only night she intended to spend that way. Grief, she had learned early, could be permitted exactly once, briefly, in private, and then it had to make room for the work, because the work did not wait for anyone's permission to grieve, and neither, she had discovered, did rent. If you have come this far, a letter, a ruin, a woman who does arithmetic instead of weeping, you may already sense where this is going, and you would not be entirely wrong. But stay a little longer. The parts worth knowing have not happened yet. Gideon arrived at Thistlemere on a wet afternoon in early April, driving a hired trap he did not entirely know how to manage, wearing a coat 2 sizes too plain for the man underneath it, and was met at the gate not by a housekeeper or a steward's assistant, but by the steward herself, standing in the mud in boots that had been resoled twice, directing 2 men in the removal of a fallen elm from the drive, as though she had done this precise task 100 times before, because she had. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, quickly, completely, without wasting a second look on anything that did not need one. "You're the new coachman," she said. Not a question. "Ash, is it? You're late. The horse doesn't care that the roads are bad. He cares that his stall isn't mucked. Barns through the yard." And then she turned back to the elm, and that was the whole of his welcome to the house he owned. He had expected. He was not entirely sure what he had expected. Deference, perhaps, even from a woman who did not know who he was. Some natural courtliness owed to a stranger arriving at a gentleman's estate. What he received instead was a set of practical instructions, delivered without warmth and without cruelty. The tone of a woman with 40 tasks ahead of her and no time to spend impressing a coachman. And Gideon Ashworth, who had spent 31 years being deferred to by people who wanted something from him, found the absence of it oddly bracing, like cold water after a long time indoors. The barn, when he found it, was in better repair than the house. That told him something, too. He learned the rhythm of Thistlemere the way any hired man would have, slowly, through his hands, through mud and horse and the particular ache of muscles unused to real labor. He mucked stalls. He mended a section of fence Elsbeth Calloway had marked with a strip of red cloth 3 days before he arrived, because she marked everything that needed doing and trusted the doing of it to whoever came next, without supervising, without hovering, as though she had decided long ago that watching a man work was a poorer use of her time than doing her own. He drove the cart to the village for supplies and back, and on the second such trip, he understood, from the way the shopkeeper's face changed at the mention of Thistlemere, that the estate's reputation in its own parish was not merely poor, but actively pitied. The way people pity a horse, everyone agrees, should have been put down. Prewitt visited twice in Gideon's first fortnight, and both times Gideon watched him from the yard with the particular attention of a man watching someone handle his own property carelessly. The land agent had a way of standing that suggested he owned everything he looked at, a habit of addressing Elsbeth as though she were a clever servant, rather than the steward whose signature carried the same authority as his own. And on his second visit, he informed her, in front of the whole yard, that the quarterly reports she had submitted were unsatisfactory, and that he would be recommending to the Duke, meaning, though he did not know it, to the man currently forking hay 11 feet away, that Thistlemere be sold before autumn, regardless of what improvements she made. "The improvements are in the reports," Elsbeth said. Her voice did not rise. It rarely did. Gideon had noticed this already, the way she seemed to keep some deep well of calm that other people spent themselves reaching for and never found. "If you read them." "I read what I need to read." Prewitt's smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "A tenant's daughter playing steward. It's a kindness, you understand, that I let it continue at all." Gideon set down his fork. He did not speak. A coachman did not speak to a land agent about the treatment of a steward, not without inviting questions about why a coachman cared. But something in him filed the sentence away with the particular attention of a man building a case, and he found, walking back to the barn afterward, that his hands were not entirely steady, and that the unsteadiness surprised him. That night he ate in the kitchen with the rest of the household, which was smaller than any household he had ever sat down with. Himself, Elsbeth, an elderly cook named Mrs. Fenwick, who had stayed on for wages that were often late, and a boy of 14 who did whatever needed doing and asked to be called Tam. Elsbeth ate quickly and without ceremony, the meal of someone who considered eating a task to be completed rather than an occasion to be enjoyed. And when Tam knocked over the salt, she reached across without comment and righted it before it could spill onto his plate, the gesture so unthinking it seemed to belong to muscle rather than mind. It was Mrs. Fenwick who first told Gideon, unprompted over the washing up, that the young steward had walked 6 miles in the rain the week before his arrival to argue a tenant's rent down herself, on foot, because the trap needed the wheel he had not yet been hired to mend. "She'll ruin her own health minding everyone else's ledger," the cook said, not unkindly, "and never once complain of it, which is worse because there's no arguing a person out of a habit they won't admit to having." Gideon thought about that sentence for 3 days. The brass button came into his life on the 9th day, in the ordinary way that small things enter a story, before anyone understands their weight. His coat, the plain hired coat he wore as Ash, lost one at the shoulder seam while he was clearing brush along the drive, and he did not notice until Elsbeth found it that evening in the grass and turned it over in her palm before handing it to him. "That's old work," she said. "Not the sort they make now. See the stamp." She showed him a small crest, worn nearly smooth, the kind of detail a coachman's coat should never have carried, because it was not a coachman's button at all. It was a Thistlemere button, off a livery coat 2 generations old, the sort that had not been issued to staff in Gideon's own memory. He had, in his haste to dress plainly, taken the coat from a trunk in the London house without checking its history, and the small crest sewn into its brass was his own family's, half worn away by time, but unmistakable to anyone who looked closely enough, and Elsbeth Calloway looked closely at everything. She did not ask where a hired coachman had come by a coat with a duke's crest on its buttons. She only handed it back to him, said, "Mind you sew it properly, it'll only fall again," and went back to whatever ledger waited for her at the kitchen table. And Gideon understood, watching her go, that she had noticed and chosen, for reasons of her own, which he could not yet guess at, not to press. He kept the button loose in his pocket after that, rather than sewn back on, though he could not have said why. It sat there through a fortnight of mucking stalls and mending fence, a small, hard weight against his hip that he found himself touching, without quite meaning to, whenever Elsbeth Calloway said something that struck him as truer than anything he'd been told by anyone in London in a decade. "If you are still here, walking these muddy roads with a duke who does not yet know how to be an honest man, you might as well stay for what comes next, because it is here, in a season of small, honest work, that the story actually begins to turn, and it would be a shame to miss it for the sake of stopping now." The spring at Thistlemere was not gentle. Elsbeth Calloway ran the estate the way a general runs a siege, methodically, without waste, prioritizing what could be saved over what merely looked as though it should be. The orchard came first, because fruit sold and fruit fed people, and the trees, though badly pruned for years, were not dead, only neglected. And neglect, she told Gideon once, without quite meaning to explain herself, was not the same as ruin. Ruin was a choice made and left unmade. Neglect was only a debt that had not yet been called in. The mill came second, and here Gideon found himself genuinely useful for the first time in his life, in a way that had nothing to do with his name. He had, as a boy, spent an idle summer at his grandfather's mill in Kent, watching the millwright work, absorbing more than he had realized at the time. And when Elsbeth stood before the seized wheel of the Thistlemere mill, with the particular stillness of a woman calculating whether a thing was worth saving, Gideon, Ash, to her, still only Ash, stepped forward and told her what he thought was wrong with the gearing, and was right. She looked at him then, the way she had not looked at him before, not with suspicion exactly, but with the recalculation of a woman revising a column of figures she had thought was closed. A coachman who knows mill work, she said. A man picks things up, he said, which was true and also nothing, and she let it stand, though he saw her file it away the same way she had filed away the button, in that quiet ledger she seemed to keep of everyone around her, weighing what didn't add up. They worked the mill together for the better part of a fortnight, and it was in that fortnight, more than in any conversation, that Gideon learned who she was. She did not speak of her father's debt, not directly, but he pieced together enough from Mrs. Fenwick and from the shape of her silences that he understood the essential fact of her, that she had been given nothing, that everything she now stood on had been built by her own hands out of what other people had discarded, and that she did this not with bitterness, which would have been easier to bear witness to, but with a kind of patient, unshowy competence that made bitterness look like a luxury she had simply never had time for. "You don't ask for help," he said to her once, both of them soaked to the elbow in the mill race, hauling a section of broken sluice gate between them. "I ask," she said. "I ask the mill what's wrong with it. I ask the ledger what it's hiding. I don't waste breath asking people, mostly, because people say yes and then don't come, and the mill doesn't lie to you the way people do." She said this without self-pity, the way she said everything, as a fact rather than a wound. And Gideon, who had spent his whole life surrounded by people who said yes to a duke and meant nothing by it, understood for the first time in his adult life what it might be to be believed only by machinery and soil, and never quite by anyone who could choose to leave. He thought of his father then, who had let Thistlemere rot at a distance through paper, and of himself, who had come to look at it once before selling it, and felt something in his chest that he did not yet have a name for, except that it felt uncomfortably like shame. The tenants did not trust her at first, and Gideon watched that distrust unmake itself slowly, in a way that told him more about her than any conversation could have. There was a widow at the easternmost cottage, a woman named Harriet Pell, who had lost a husband to the same land agent's arithmetic 2 years before Elsbeth's own family fell to it, and who greeted the new steward's first visit with a closed door and a message passed through her eldest son that she wanted no more promises from Thistlemere, having buried enough of them already. Elsbeth did not argue the point. She left a sack of seed grain on the widow's step without knocking, said nothing about it to anyone, and returned a fortnight later to mend a section of the woman's fence herself, in the rain, without being asked and without expecting thanks. It took the better part of 2 months before Harriet Pell opened her door to a second visit, and when she did, it was only to say, flatly, that she supposed the girl had better come in out of the wet before she caught her death being stubborn on a doorstep. Gideon, driving past on the lane with a delivery of feed, saw the door open and understood, in that small, unremarked moment, more about how Thistlemere would be saved than he had understood from any ledger. It would not be saved by a single grand gesture. It would be saved the way Harriet Pell's trust had been. One unasked for kindness at a time, repeated past the point where lesser people would have given up expecting any return on it at all. By the end of April, 3 more tenant families who had been prepared to leave at the first opportunity had quietly decided to stay another season, Not because Elsbeth had promised them anything better than honest treatment, but because honest treatment, after Prewitt's 11 years, had turned out to be worth more than any promise they had been given before. Prewitt's third visit came at the end of April, and it was the one that showed Gideon most clearly what kind of man his father had entrusted with 70 miles of tenant land. The agent arrived with a paper for Elsbeth's signature, a revised rent schedule for 3 of the outlying cottages, raised by an amount that Gideon, watching from the yard, understood immediately no tenant on that land could pay. "You'll sign it," Prewitt said, "or I'll have the Duke's authority to remove you from the post and manage the rents myself, which I assure you, Miss Calloway, will go rather worse for your tenants than it will for you. These families can't pay this. Then they'll leave, and I'll find families who can, and Thistlemere will finally turn the profit it should have turned a decade ago." He smiled the smile Gideon had already learned to dislike intensely. "Sentiment is not a line item, Miss Calloway. I'd have thought a woman in your position would understand that better than most." It was, Gideon understood later, a deliberate cruelty, a reference to her father, to the debt, to the tenancy she had lost, delivered with the precision of a man who enjoyed knowing exactly where to press. Elsbeth did not flinch, not visibly, not in any way a stranger would have caught, but Gideon was no longer entirely a stranger, and he saw the stillness settle over her the particular way it settled when something had actually landed, the same stillness he had begun to recognize as her only tell, the one crack in a woman otherwise built like stone. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. She took the paper, read it through once, and said, "I'll need 3 days to review the tenancy agreements before I sign anything binding." And Prewitt, who had clearly expected either capitulation or a fight, and received neither, was left with no graceful way to refuse a reasonable request, and left in poor temper, which Gideon found, watching him go, to be the first entirely satisfying moment of his month at Thistlemere. That night, Gideon didn't sleep. He sat in the barn loft with the ledgers he had no legitimate right to see, and worked through the arithmetic of 11 years of Josiah Prewitt's management, with the particular fury of a man discovering, in his own name, the precise shape of a crime. The numbers, once he knew to look for them, were not even especially well hidden. Rents collected and only partially forwarded, repairs billed to the estate and never performed, a pattern of manufactured tenant debts that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the debt that had cost Elsbeth Calloway's family their own land 3 parishes over, the kind of pattern that suggested this was not Prewitt's first use of the method, and would not be his last, unless someone with real authority stopped him. He had the authority. He had simply not yet told anyone he possessed it. If a story asks anything reasonable of you, it is only this: that you stay long enough to see whether a quiet man does the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. Subscribe if you'd like to be here for that part. The ledger is not finished yet, and neither is he. The 3 days Elsbeth had bought herself were spent, Gideon learned, not in review, but in preparation. She rode out to each of the 3 cottages herself, spoke to each family, and began quietly reorganizing the estate's accounts to absorb what she could of the burden without the tenants ever knowing a fight had been fought on their behalf. She did not tell Gideon what she was doing. She did not, in fact, tell anyone. He learned it only by watching her, by noticing the hours she kept and the routes she rode, and by the particular set of her shoulders each evening when she returned, tired in the specific way of someone who has spent a day being strong on other people's behalf and has no one to be tired in front of once the door closes. On the second evening, he found her at the kitchen table long after Mrs. Fenwick and Tam had gone to bed, a single candle burning low, the ledgers spread before her in the particular chaos of a mind working faster than a hand can write. She did not look up when he came in. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." She did look up then, and there was something in her face he had not seen before. Not the stillness, not the competence, but a kind of raw fatigue she had clearly not intended anyone to witness. 3 families, Ash. If I can't make this work, 3 families lose the only home they've had in 2 generations, over an agent's arithmetic that isn't even honest arithmetic, and there is nothing I can do about the agent, only about the arithmetic, and some nights that doesn't feel like nearly enough. It's more than most people would do. Most people aren't the ones who'll answer for it if it fails. She said this simply, without asking for comfort, and Gideon, who had spent a lifetime being comforted by people who wanted something from his comfort in return, found himself unable, for the first time, to offer the easy reassurance a coachman might reasonably offer. Instead, he sat down across from her, uninvited, and said, "Show me the third cottage's figures. 2 sets of eyes count for something." She looked at him for a long moment, the look of a woman recalculating again. This coachman who knew mill work, and now apparently knew figures too. And then, instead of asking the question her face plainly wanted to ask, she simply turned the ledger to face him, and they worked until the candle guttered out, and neither of them spoke of it again, though something between them had shifted in a way that neither was yet prepared to name. He gave her back the loose brass button that same week, sewn properly this time, in a coat mended by his own uneven hand rather than a servant's, and she took it without comment, though he saw her turn it once between her fingers before she pinned it back to his shoulder herself, her hands quick and businesslike and, for just a moment, not entirely steady. There was a storm the following week, the kind that came down off the moor without warning and took the roof of the near barn with it, and Gideon and Elspeth spent the worst of it together in the dark, bracing a failing beam with nothing but rope and their own combined weight, while rain came through in sheets, and Tam ran between them, passing tools by feel. They did not speak much during it. There was no breath to spare for speech. But when the beam finally held, and the worst of the wind passed on toward the coast, they sat together in the wrecked doorway of the barn, soaked through, too tired to move further, and Elsbeth laughed, which Gideon had not once heard her do in 2 months, a short, startled sound she seemed almost surprised to have produced herself. "What," he said, "is funny about a barn roof in the next county by morning?" "Nothing," she said, still half laughing. "Everything. I don't know. I think I forgot, for a moment, to be afraid of losing something, and it felt absurd, sitting here soaked to the bone with half a roof gone, to realize that. I've spent 3 years afraid of losing things, Ash. Tonight I lost a roof and I only wanted to laugh." She looked at him sideways, rain still dripping from her hair, and something passed between them in the dark of that ruined doorway that neither of them named aloud, though both, Gideon understood later, had recognized it plainly enough at the time. The particular quiet that settles between 2 people who have just discovered they would rather face a falling roof together than face an easy evening apart. They rebuilt the barn roof properly within the fortnight, working alongside 2 hired men from the village, and Gideon found that he had begun, without quite deciding to, measuring his days by whether they would end with her at the kitchen table, ledgers or no ledgers, rather than by anything so distant as London or the title waiting for him there. There was, in the middle of that same month, a moment when the whole arrangement nearly came apart before Gideon was ready for it too. A traveling acquaintance of the family, a Mrs. Larkspur, distant cousin to a viscount, and the sort of woman who made a hobby of remembering faces precisely so she could produce them at inconvenient moments, stopped at Thistlemere's gate on her way north, her carriage wheel in need of minor repair, and stood in the yard watching the coachman work with an expression of dawning, delighted recognition that Gideon felt land in his stomach like a dropped stone. "I know that face," she said, to no one in particular, loudly enough that Elsbeth, crossing the yard with an armful of ledgers, slowed her step. I could swear I've danced with that face in a London ballroom. Gideon kept his head down over the wheel and said, in the flattest voice he could manage, that he had a common enough look, and that Mrs. Larkspur was very likely thinking of someone else entirely, and prayed, with more sincerity than he had prayed for anything in years, that she would let the matter drop. She did, eventually, distracted by the wheel's completion and her own impatience to be back on the road. But not before Elsbeth had watched the entire exchange, with the particular stillness Gideon had learned, meant she was filing something carefully away, unresolved, for later consideration. She did not ask him about it that evening, or the next, but he caught her once, several days after, studying him across the kitchen table, with an expression he could not quite read, and understood, with the specific dread of a man who has built something fragile on a foundation of omission, that the ledger in her mind wasn't yet closed, and that whatever answer she was waiting for, she intended to arrive at it herself, in her own time, the same patient way she arrived at everything. May came down warm, and the orchard began, against every expectation the parish had voiced aloud, to bear real fruit. Elsbeth had grafted new stock onto 3 of the oldest trees the previous autumn, before Gideon's arrival, a wager most stewards would not have made on an estate destined for sale. And watching the young growth take, watching her walk the rows each morning with the quiet satisfaction of someone counting a private victory, Gideon understood that she had never once, in all her months at Thistlemere, worked as though the place were doomed. She had worked as though it might yet be saved, on the strength of nothing but her own conviction that neglected things were not the same as ruined ones, and it occurred to him, walking the rows a pace behind her, that she might have been describing more than an orchard. It was in the orchard, in fact, under the oldest pear tree on the property, a tree Elsbeth herself had identified as older than the house, older even than the family that owned it, that Tom found the box. He had been digging, at Elsbeth's instruction, to loosen the soil around the roots for a new season's feeding, and the spade struck something that was not stone. What came up, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, and buried perhaps 2 feet down, was a small tin box, rusted nearly through, containing a single folded document, whose ink had survived far better than its box. Elsbeth read it first, standing in the orchard with dirt still on her hands, and Gideon watched her face change in a way he had not seen it change in 2 months of careful watching, the stillness cracking not into grief this time, but into something closer to disbelief. It was a deed, not the deed to Thistlemere, but to the Calloway tenancy, the very land her family had lost to the invented debt 3 years before. And it was accompanied by a second document, a signed and witnessed statement, dated some 15 years earlier, in which the previous land agent, Prewitt's own predecessor, had confessed under pressure from the old Duke's steward to fabricating a series of tenant debts across the estate in order to pad his own accounts, Elsbeth's family's debt named specifically among them, and the deed had been buried, it seemed, by someone who intended to right the wrong and never got the chance, an old steward, dead before he could act, who had hidden the proof rather than destroy it, trusting some future hand to find it. Gideon knelt beside her in the turned earth and read the confession a second time over her shoulder, and found, in its final line, a detail that struck him harder than anything else in the box, a note, added in a different, shakier hand, dated some months after the confession itself, that read only, "Buried here, beneath the pear tree, where I planted it myself as a boy, so that whoever finds it will know the roots of this place run deeper than any one man's dishonesty. I could not undo what was done in my lifetime. I trust this ground to keep the truth safe until someone comes who will." 15 years underground, Elsbeth said quietly, more to the tree than to him, and it waited for someone to think it worth digging for. She looked, in that moment, less like a steward, and more like a woman standing at the edge of a debt, finally, unexpectedly repaid. And Gideon understood that whatever else the discovery meant for the estate's ledgers, for her, it meant something closer to a grief finally permitted to finish. "This clears it," Elsbeth said, and her voice, for the first time since Gideon had known her, was not entirely steady. "This clears the whole debt. My father never owed a shilling. It was invented, the same as these 3 cottages, the same pattern, the same hand behind it, or a hand taught by it." She looked up at Gideon with something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, the look of a woman who has just been handed proof of an injustice she had known in her bones for years, but never been able to name aloud. 15 years, Ash. 15 years my family carried a debt that never existed, and someone knew, and buried the truth instead of speaking it, and I don't know whether to be grateful to him or furious. "Both," Gideon said quietly. "You're allowed both." And he meant it more than she could have known, because he was, in that moment, feeling something very similar about his own father, who had let a man like Pruitt manage his tenants at a distance for 11 years without once asking what that distance was costing. They did not tell Pruitt what had been found. Elsbeth, with the same methodical patience she brought to every ledger, spent the following week quietly verifying the document's provenance. A trip to the parish church to confirm the witness's identity against the burial register, a letter to a retired clerk in the county seat, who remembered the old steward and his sudden, unexplained death. Building, without ever raising her voice or showing her hand, a case that could not be dismissed as a forged or convenient discovery. Gideon watched her work with something close to awe. She was, he thought, better suited to running an estate than most men who had inherited one, and he found himself, more than once, on the verge of telling her exactly who he was, only to stop each time, uncertain whether the truth would be received as a confession or a betrayal, and unwilling, until he was certain, to risk losing the only honest regard he had ever been given. He did not have to choose the moment. The moment chose him. Pruitt arrived unannounced in the 2nd week of June, and this time he did not come alone. He brought a bailiff and a paper authorizing, in the Duke's name, the immediate removal of the Calloway family's remaining claim and the dismissal of Elsbeth Calloway from her post, on grounds, the paper said, of financial mismanagement. "You've been altering the rent ledgers," Pruitt said in the yard, in front of the whole household. Mrs. Fenwick wringing her apron by the kitchen door, and Tam gone pale and silent beside the stable. "Reducing collections without authority. I've written to the Duke myself with the particulars. You'll be gone by the week's end, and count yourself fortunate it isn't the constable at your door instead of mine." "I altered nothing without cause," Elsbeth said, and for the first time Gideon heard real anger under the stillness, banked but unmistakable. "The rents were fraudulent, the same as my father's debt, the same pattern going back 15 years, and I have the proof of it." Proof. Pruitt's laugh had no warmth in it at all. "A tenant's daughter's word against 11 years of my management, and a duke who has never once set foot on this property to check either of our accounts. Do you imagine he'll take yours?" It was, Gideon understood, precisely the moment he had been avoiding, and precisely the moment that could no longer be avoided. He stepped forward out of the stable doorway, and something in his bearing, some old habit of command he had not entirely managed to disguise even in 2 months of hauling hay, made Pruitt's eyes narrow before a single word had been spoken. "He'll take hers," Gideon said, "because he's standing in the yard, listening to you." The silence that followed was, Gideon thought afterward, the longest of his life. He watched it land on Pruitt first, the recalculation, swift and ugly, as the land agent's mind reordered 2 months of memory into a single, mortifying shape. He watched it land on Mrs. Fenwick, whose hand flew to her mouth, and he watched it land, last and hardest, on Elsbeth, whose face did something he had never seen it do before. A flicker of betrayal so quick and so thoroughly mastered that had he not spent 2 months learning to read her stillness, he might have missed it entirely. "Your," Prewitt began. "Gideon Ashworth, Duke of Thistlemere's Holdings, among others, and the man to whom you've been writing quarterly reports for 11 years, describing a ruin you yourself have been quietly profiting from creating." Gideon's voice was not raised. He had learned that from her. He realized even as he spoke that the quietest voice in a yard commands it more completely than the loudest. "I have the ledgers, Mr. Prewitt. I have had them since April. I have cross-checked 11 years of your accounts against the actual condition of every property under your management, and I have, as of this week, a signed statement from your own predecessor confirming the method you inherited and continued. You are dismissed from every post you hold in my name, effective this hour, and you will consider yourself fortunate if it is only dismissal you face once the full accounting is made public before the county magistrate." Prewitt did not stay to argue the point. Men who build their power on the absence of scrutiny rarely do well under the sudden presence of it, and he left the yard with the particular haste of a man doing arithmetic of his own, considerably less favorable than any he had previously performed, the bailiff trailing uncertainly behind him, the dismissal papers left crumpled and forgotten on the mounting block. The bailiff, before he followed his employer out through the gate, paused a moment beside Gideon and said, low enough that Prewitt would not hear it, that he had suspected for some time the land agent's accounts did not sit right, but had never had the standing to say so to anyone who might act on it. Gideon told him to present himself at the house the following week if he wanted honest work under honest management, and the man, visibly startled to be offered anything at all by the household he had come to help dismantle, said that he would. Mrs. Fenwick did not move from the kitchen doorway the entire time, her apron twisted in both hands, and it was only once the gate had swung shut behind the bailiff's departing cart that she let out a long breath and said, to the yard in general, that she had known there was something not quite Coachman about the new coachman from the very first week, on account of the way he held a teacup, though she had kept her own counsel about it, the way any sensible woman would. Elsbeth did not speak to Gideon for the rest of that day. She was not, he understood, angry that he was a duke. She had suspected as much for weeks, he realized later, from the button onward, and had simply chosen, in her own methodical way, to withhold judgment until she had more evidence, the same patience she brought to every ledger. What she could not forgive so quickly was the 2 months of silence, the small daily dishonesty of letting her speak to him as an equal, mend his coat, share her fear over a candle at midnight, all while he withheld the one fact that would have changed the shape of every conversation between them. He found her that evening at the mill, standing at the wheel that now turned properly because of work they had done together with their own 4 hands, and he did not try to excuse himself. "I should have told you," he said. "Not eventually. At the start." "Yes." She did not turn around. "You should have." "I told myself I wanted to see the place honestly before I sold it. That was true. For a week. Maybe 2. After that, I think I stayed silent because I liked being a man you'd trust on his own merits, rather than a title you'd have to be polite to. That's not an excuse. I know it isn't." "No," she said, "it isn't." But she did turn then, and there was something in her face that was not quite forgiveness, but was perhaps the beginning of the road toward it. The same recalculation he had watched her perform a dozen times over 2 months, except this time he understood. She was not weighing whether to trust the evidence of a stranger. She was weighing whether the 2 months of a man named Ash could still be true, even now that she knew the rest of his name. "You worked the mill with your own hands. You sat up over ledgers past midnight for tenants who weren't yours to protect. Not officially, not yet. Whatever else you are, Gideon Ashworth, I don't think that part was a lie. It wasn't, he said. It's the truest thing I've done in years. She looked at him a long moment, the mill wheel turning steady behind her, water and light moving together, the way they hadn't moved at Thistlemere in a decade before she arrived to make them move again, and she said, finally, quietly, "Then perhaps we begin again from there. Not from the title, from the mill." It was not forgiveness delivered all at once, the way it might have come in a gentler story. It was the beginning of trust, rebuilt the same way she rebuilt everything, methodically, one honest day at a time, with no promises made faster than the evidence could support them, and Gideon found that he did not want it any other way. A woman who forgave everything instantly had not been worth the 2 months it took to earn her good opinion in the first place. If you have stayed this long, through the mud, the mill, the button, the silence in the yard, you have already given this story more patience than most give anything these days. And it is exactly that kind of patience the story is about. Stay a little longer yet. The magistrate has not heard the case, and Josiah Prewitt has not yet answered for 15 years. The magistrate's hearing, when it came in late June, was a smaller and quieter affair than either the crime or its unraveling deserved, held in the county seat's modest sessions room before a bench of 3 local men who listened to 11 years of falsified ledgers read aloud in the flat, unforgiving voice of Gideon's own solicitor, sent north at last with proper authority and a face of barely concealed horror at what his employer had uncovered without him. Elsbeth testified to the pattern of manufactured tenant debts, her own family's among them, with the same composed precision she brought to every account she had ever kept. And it was her steadiness, more than any document, that seemed to settle the matter in the magistrate's mind. A woman who had lost everything to this exact fraud, and still spoke of it, without a single tremor in her voice, carried a particular kind of weight that bluster could not counter. Prewitt attempted, briefly, to argue that the buried confession was itself a forgery, a convenient discovery timed to ruin him, and was undone entirely by the parish register Elsbeth had already quietly verified, and by the retired clerk who traveled 2 days to testify, unprompted and unpaid, that he remembered the old steward's death well, and had always wondered why the man had seemed, in his final weeks, like someone carrying a weight he intended to set down and never got the chance to. Harriet Pell testified as well, though no one had asked her to, standing in her good black dress with her hands folded in front of her, the way she must have stood at her husband's own burial, and told the bench in a voice that did not waver that she had watched a girl mend her fence in the rain without being asked, and had watched that same girl, months later, walk 7 miles in worse rain to argue down a rent increase for cottages that were not even her own family's concern, and that whatever the county's book said about who could be trusted, she herself had already decided the matter some time before the law caught up to her opinion. It was not evidence, strictly, and the magistrate said as much, gently, before allowing it into the record regardless. But Gideon watched 2 of the 3 men on the bench exchange a look after she spoke that told him the widow's word had done more for the case than half the ledgers combined. Gideon testified last and briefly, laying out in plain terms the discrepancy between 11 years of quarterly reports and the estate he had found on arriving. A duke's word, weighed against a land agent's in a room that understood exactly what that imbalance was worth, though Gideon made a point in his own testimony of saying aloud that it should not have needed a duke's word at all, that Elsbeth Calloway's own accounting, had anyone troubled to examine it honestly a decade earlier, would have told the same story without any title attached to lend it credibility. It was, he thought afterward, the truest thing he said all day, and the one that seemed to land hardest on the bench, several of whom were themselves men who managed land through agents they rarely visited, and who left the sessions room, Gideon suspected, considerably less comfortable in that arrangement than they had arrived. The judgment was not gentle. Prewitt lost his post, his license to manage any estate in the county, and a portion of his own considerable fortune to restitution, the Callaway tenancy restored in full and backdated, the 3 cottages' rents struck from the record entirely, and a formal accounting ordered of every property he had touched in 11 years, a process that would, Gideon's solicitor predicted grimly, take the better part of 2 years to complete, and would very likely uncover fraud on properties far beyond Thistlemere's modest borders. Elsbeth did not celebrate the verdict the way Gideon had half expected. No triumph, no bitter satisfaction directed at the man who had cost her family so much. She only walked out of the sessions room into the June sunlight, stood a moment with her face turned up to it, and said quietly, to no one in particular, "Living," which was, Gideon understood without needing it explained, the whole of what she felt, and the whole of what she intended to do next, both at once, in a single word that needed no others around it. He did not sell Thistlemere. He had known, somewhere around the mill, or perhaps around the midnight ledgers, or perhaps as early as the yard on the day she called him late without knowing his name, that he was never going to sell it, that a place a woman had loved back into usefulness, with nothing but patience and unglamorous labor, was not a property to be liquidated, but an inheritance in the truest sense. The only one his father had left him that had actually turned out to be worth something once someone bothered to look closely at it. He told his solicitor to withdraw the sale within a week of the verdict, and told Elsbeth the same evening, in the orchard, under the pear tree that had kept her family's justice buried and safe for 15 years, until the right hands came to dig it up. "I'm not selling," he said. "I want you to stay on as steward, properly this time. Full authority. Your name on the deed of management. Answerable to no one Prewitt's equal ever again. And if I say I'd rather not work for a duke who lied to me for 2 months, then I'll hire you as a consultant for every other property I own, at whatever fee you name, and never once tell you what to do with any of them, because you'd do it better than I could regardless." He said it lightly, but he meant every word, and she must have heard that, because something in her face, not quite a smile, not yet, but the ancestor of one, answered him before her words did. "I'd want the orchard properly deeded to the estate accounts, not held loose the way it's been. And Tam apprenticed to the miller. You're going to have to actually hire now that the wheel turns. And Mrs. Fenwick's wages raised, and never late again. Not 1 quarter, not ever. Done, all of it. Then I'll stay." She looked at him a long moment, the evening light catching gold in the leaves above them, the pears not yet ripe but heavy with the promise of it. "Not because you're a duke, Gideon. I want that understood plainly, the way I want every account understood plainly. I'll stay because you worked the mill with your own hands, and didn't stop when your back knew it was the work of a duke and not a coachman. That's the only ledger that matters to me." "It's the only one that ever should have," he said, and reached into his coat and drew out the brass button, the old Thistlemere button she had found in the grass in April, and sewn back onto a poor man's coat, without asking a single question she had every right to ask, and held it out to her now, in the orchard, in the last of the June light. "I'd like you to keep this, not as a duke's crest, as the button off the coat of a man who mucked your stalls and mended your fences, and never once, in 2 months, heard you ask for help you didn't strictly need, and admired you more for the asking he never got to give." She took it from his palm, and this time her hands were not steady at all, and neither, if he was honest, were his. A year passed, and it passed the way a year passes at a place that has finally been allowed to heal instead of merely survive, steadily, without drama, each season doing the ordinary work that seasons do when no one is starving them of what they need. The mill turned through harvest and ground grain for 6 parishes, not one. The orchard bore its first full crop under the new grafts, and the pears sold at market for a price that made the county's other stewards start asking Elsbeth, rather sheepishly, for her methods. The 3 cottages Prewitt had tried to empty stood full, their rents fair, their roofs sound, and Tam, 12 months older and a head taller, spent his afternoons at the miller's elbow, learning a trade that would keep him fed for the rest of his life, without ever once needing to depend on anyone's mercy. Winter came down hard that year, as it always did in the north, and Elsbeth did not break under it, because there was nothing left at Thistlemere for winter to break. The roof held, the stores held, the people held, together, the way a household holds when every person in it has been genuinely valued rather than merely tolerated. And Gideon, who had spent 31 years believing that a great house was measured by its title and its acreage, learned, in that one hard northern winter, what a house was actually measured by, which had nothing to do with either. They married in early spring, in the orchard, under the pear tree in full and improbable bloom, with Mrs. Fenwick weeping openly into a handkerchief she pretended was for her cold, and Tam standing straight-backed and proud in a coat that fit him for the first time in his life, and the whole parish that had once pitied Thistlemere, the way one pities a dying horse turning out instead, almost to a household, to see what had been built from a ruin that everyone else had agreed was worthless. Elsbeth wore no grand gown, because she had never wanted one, and Gideon, by then, understood her well enough not to offer what she had not asked for. She wore instead a plain dress of good cloth she had sewn herself over the winter evenings, with a small brass button pinned at her collar, where another woman might have worn a jewel. And when the vicar asked whether she took this man, she answered the way she answered everything, without flourish, without hesitation, entirely, and only the truth. "I do," she said. "I did, in fact, before I even knew his name. If you have walked this whole road, the letter, the ruin, the button, the buried deed, the year of quiet, unglamorous work that finally paid what it was owed, you already know why stories like this one are worth staying for, and worth returning for the next time one begins. If this found you at the right moment, consider subscribing before you go. There is always another ruin somewhere, and always, if you look closely enough, someone patient enough to make it grow again." Gideon stood in that orchard many years later, long after Tam had become a miller in his own right, with an apprentice of his own. Long after Mrs. Fenwick had been laid to rest under a stone Elsbeth chose herself and visited every quarter without fail, long after the county had stopped speaking of Thistlemere as a cautionary tale, and started speaking of it, instead, as the model every other struggling estate was measured against, and watched his wife walk the rows the way she had walked them on the very first morning he'd seen her, checking each tree with the same unhurried attention, as though every single one of them still mattered exactly as much as it had the day it was nearly lost. The pears fell heavy that autumn, the way they had fallen every autumn since the year the box was found beneath the oldest tree on the property, and smoke rose thin and gold from the kitchen chimney, where a new cook, trained by Mrs. Fenwick's own exacting hand before the end, kept the ovens running for a household that had never once, in all the years since, gone hungry or unheard. Their eldest daughter, 5 years old that autumn, and already possessed of her mother's habit of noticing everything before anyone thought to explain it to her, ran the rows behind them, collecting windfall pears in the front of her pinafore, stopping every so often to inspect a graft scar on one of the older trees, the way she had seen her mother inspect it 100 times. Small fingers tracing the healed place where new wood had been joined to old. She did not yet know the story of the box beneath the tree, or the button at her mother's collar, or the year her parents had spent circling each other in careful, patient honesty before either one had dared to call it love. She only knew that the orchard was hers to run in, and that every tree in it had a name, because her mother had taught her, the way someone had once taught her mother, that nothing worth keeping ever grew properly while it was made to stand entirely alone. Elsbeth caught a falling pear without looking up, the old instinct still perfect after all this time, and held it out to him across the row without a word, the way she had once handed back a brass button she had every right to question, and chose instead to trust. He took it. He always would. Everything grows, she had told him once, in the mill, in the dark, with water turning steady behind her. Everything grows when it is no longer alone.